Imagine a world where justice is synonymous with terror, and order only exists under the shadow of piles of bodies. A prince who, to save his people, became an immortal monster. This is the story of Vlad the Impaler. For many, he is one of history's most bloodthirsty tyrants. For others, a forgotten hero, Europe's shield against the Ottoman Empire. Have you ever wondered if the real Dracula was more terrifying than any vampire? And if cruelty might be the only way out when all is lost? Prepare to uncover the truth behind the legend. If this journey intrigues you, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters. Your support is vital to help more people discover these incredible stories. And tell us, where are you watching this historical immersion from? Leave your comment right now. In the twilight of the 15th century, Eastern Europe burned under the relentless flames of a brutal power struggle. This wasn't merely a series of isolated skirmishes, but a vast, intricate geopolitical chessboard where empires clashed and entire kingdoms hung by a thread. The grand actor in this tragedy, and the greatest threat to Christendom, was the Ottoman Empire. From its constantly expanding heart, in what we now know as Turkey, Ottoman power, having already subjugated vast portions of the Balkans, such as Serbia in 1389 at the legendary Battle of Kosovo, and Bulgaria in 1396, advanced like an unyielding tide. Constantinople, the ancient jewel of the Byzantine Empire and the last Christian bastion at the crossroads of East and West, felt the chilling breath of this inevitable conquest, which would materialize in 1453. In this landscape of domination, Wallachia, a small Orthodox Christian principality now part of modern Romania, found itself in a desperate and precarious position. Situated south of the Carpathian Mountains and north of the mighty Danube River, Wallachia was literally a borderland, a natural battlefield between the Ottoman hammer and the Hungarian anvil. To the north, the Kingdom of Hungary, a Catholic power, exerted its own pressure, often using Wallachia as a buffer state or even a pawn in its territorial and religious ambitions. Wallachia's very geography, with its forested hills gently rolling before dramatically rising eastward into the rocky peaks of the Carpathians, and the Danube serving as a natural frontier, dictated its destiny of constant conflict. This land, shaped by centuries of invasions and conquests, from Roman Dacia abandoned by the empire, to waves of Goths, Bulgarians, and Turks, never knew true peace. The region was a melting pot of cultures and loyalties, where survival demanded fluid alliances and unending political cunning. Wallachian rulers, even before Vlad, lived in a web of intrigues, seeking to balance vassalage to the Hungarians, who promised Christian protection, with paying tribute to the Ottomans, who demanded submission in exchange for a tenuous non-aggression. This was the world of perpetual conflict in which the central figure of our story would be forged, an environment where brute force often spoke louder than diplomacy, and where the very survival of the nation was a daily struggle against giants. It was in this cauldron of tensions that the seed of one of European history's darkest and most fascinating legends would be planted. Amidst this tapestry of fragile alliances and constant battles, in the year 1431, within the fortified town of Sighișoara, in the frosty lands of Transylvania, a child was born, destined to alter the course of Wallachian history and to be immortalized in popular imagination. This was Vlad III, the son of Vlad II Dracula, a name that would echo through centuries with a mix of terror and fascination. Sighișoara, even today a UNESCO World Heritage Site with its well-preserved medieval buildings, was a fortified Saxon trading hub, a bastion of prosperity and order in a region plagued by instability. Vlad's birth there, rather than in the Wallachian capital Târgoviște, reflects his father's complex and often precarious position. Vlad II, though a Wallachian prince, frequently operated from Transylvanian bases, seeking Hungarian support or refuge from Wallachia's internal intrigues. Vlad's father, Vlad II Dracula, was no ordinary figure. His complex ascent to power in Wallachia was marked by a relentless cycle of depositions and restorations, a testament to the era's shifting alliances and treacherous politics. He ascended to the Wallachian throne in 1436, but even before that, He had distinguished himself through military prowess and connections with the most influential Christian military orders in Europe. It was precisely in 1431, the year of his son's birth, that Vlad II was inducted into one of the most prestigious and feared knightly orders of the time, the Order of the Dragon. His initiation ceremony took place in Nuremberg, in the presence of Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund of Luxembourg, the order's founder. This membership was more than symbolic. It bestowed upon Vlad III not only prestige, but a sacred and perilous mission to defend Christendom against its enemies, particularly the relentless advance of the Ottoman Empire. It was from this association that he earned the name by which he would be known, Vlad Dracula, meaning Vlad the Dragon. This epithet, which at first glance might sound noble and heroic, carried a linguistic and symbolic duality that would prove crucial to his son's legend. This paternal surname, Dracula, would pass down to the lineage, and his children, including Vlad III, would be known as Draculia or Draculești, which literally means son of the dragon. However, the Romanian word Dracul also carries the meaning of devil. Thus young Vlad III from birth bore in his name a premonition of his destiny, an ambivalence that would see him hailed as a defender of faith by some and damned as an embodiment of evil by others. He entered a world where his name was simultaneously a badge of honor and a curse, a promise of power and a foreshadowing of horror, all set against a backdrop of conflict where the line between hero and monster was thin and constantly blurred. To understand the figure of Vlad the Impaler and the origin of his formidable name, it is essential to delve into the details of the Order of the Dragon, a knightly brotherhood that shaped the destiny of his lineage. Founded in 1408 by Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund of Luxembourg, the Order of the Dragon was not merely a group of nobles with striking insignias. It was a military religious force with a singular and urgent purpose: to defend Christendom from the relentless advance of the Ottoman Empire. 15th century Europe was on high alert. After the fall of significant Christian kingdoms in the Balkans under Ottoman rule, the crusade against the infidels was no longer a distant adventure, but a pressing necessity for self-defense. The Order of the Dragon gathered elite monarchs and nobles, primarily from Central and Eastern Europe, including kingdoms like Hungary, Bohemia, Poland, and principalities such as Wallachia and Moldavia, who pledged loyalty and commitment to combat the Turks and other threats to the Christian faith. Its symbol, a winged dragon with its tail coiled around its neck, represented both the pagan enemy to be fought and, for its members, the cunning and strength required to confront it. Within the symbol, a red cross emphasized the sacred nature of their mission. Vlad II, father of the future Impaler, was initiated into the order in 1431, the same year Vlad III was born. This initiation not only bestowed upon him the prestigious epithet Dracul, dragon, but also entangled him in a complex web of alliances and expectations. As a member of the order, Vlad II was expected to actively fight against the Ottomans, which placed him in an even more vulnerable position between the Sultan and the Kingdom of Hungary. The Order of the Dragon, therefore, was not merely a symbol of honor, but a constant reminder of the dangers and commitments resting upon its members. The duality of the name Dracul is crucial. While at the time it primarily referred to the dragon of the order's symbol, the Romanian word carries a dark resonance. Dracul also means devil or demon. This ambiguity would prophetically manifest in the figure of Vlad III, who would inherit the moniker. His enemies in Western legends would associate him with the devil, while his defenders would see him as the protective dragon of his people, the fierce guardian against invaders. The Order of the Dragon, though not a decisive military force in the war against the Ottomans, was an important center of political and military coordination in an era of fragmentation. For Vlad's family, it represented both a seal of nobility and duty, and a source of tragedy. Vlad II's association with the order placed him in the crosshairs of both the Ottomans and his own Christian neighbors, who doubted his loyalty or saw him as a rival. Thus, the name Dracul, and consequently Draculea, son of the dragon, became a heritage of power and a curse, a legacy of iron and fire that would be forged into the soul of young Vlad III. Vlad III's childhood was not marked by the usual play and education of a European prince, but by the harsh reality of captivity and the imposition of forced servitude. In 1442, when Vlad was just 11 years old, and his younger brother Radu around 6, their lives were drastically altered by a political decision made by their father, Vlad II Dracula. In an act of desperation to secure peace with the overwhelming Ottoman Empire and to guarantee his own position on the Wallachian throne, Vlad II was coerced by Sultan Mehmed II into handing over his 2 sons as hostages. This was no mere symbolic gesture. It was a literal guarantee of the father's loyalty to the Ottoman power. The young princes were taken to Adrianople, Edirne, then the Ottoman capital, a vibrant and exotic center, but for them, a true golden cage. Far from the familiarity of their lands and the embrace of their family, Vlad and Radu were immersed in an environment that was simultaneously one of luxury and absolute control. They received an elite education, learning about science, philosophy, languages, and crucially, the complex arts of Turkish warfare. The Ottoman court, with its rigorous discipline and implacable hierarchy, offered a privileged glimpse into the military and administrative machine that so terrorized Europe. However, this education came with a devastating psychological and emotional cost. Vlad and Radu were exposed firsthand to the brutal methods of punishment and torture employed by the Ottomans to maintain order and intimidate their enemies. They witnessed public beheadings, the application of lashings, and most notably for Vlad, the practice of impalement. This technique, where victims were skewered on sharpened stakes and left to die slowly in agony, was a cruel way to display Ottoman power and authority. For young Vlad, who carried a latent hatred and a thirst for justice, these scenes were not just spectacles of horror, but vivid lessons in how fear could be used as the most potent of weapons. The experience as a hostage was not merely a deprivation of freedom, it was a complete reconfiguration of his identity. Vlad saw himself as a pawn in the hands of his father and the Sultan, his own survival depending on distant political maneuvers. This experience of powerlessness and the constant veiled threat forged in him a layer of distrust and resentment that would accompany him throughout his life. Vlad's stolen childhood was, therefore, the seed of his future cruelty, a period of forced learning that would transform him from a captive prince into a master of terror tactics, with impalement becoming his indelible signature. It was the beginning of the forging of a tyrant, driven by humiliation and the desire to never again be vulnerable. The years of captivity in the Ottoman court were the crucible where Vlad III's soul was forged, transforming the young captive prince into a figure of undeniable brutality. Far from being a mere period of exile, his stay in Adrianople, under the watchful eye of Sultan Mehmed II, and subsequently his son, the young Mehmed, was a merciless school of power and survival. Vlad was exposed not only to Ottoman grandeur and military discipline, but also, and more profoundly, to the darkest and most effective side of their control, torture and execution as tools of the state. Within the palace walls and outside them in public squares, Vlad witnessed a parade of horrors that would profoundly mark him. Summary beheadings of enemies, lashings inflicted for any insubordination, and, most notably, the practice of impalement. This technique, not exclusive to the Ottomans but widely employed by them, involved skewering victims on sharpened stakes, where they would die slowly, often over several days, under public gaze. For the Ottomans, impalement was a clear and unequivocal demonstration of their authority, and an effective way to intimidate conquered populations and enemies. For young Vlad, these scenes were not mere atrocities, they were lessons in strategy. He observed the power of terror to paralyze opposition and impose absolute order, while his brother, Radu, adapted to court life, learning the language, customs, and even becoming a favorite of Mehmed. Vlad internalized hatred and resistance. Contemporary accounts describe Vlad as infinitely troublesome, insolent, and subject to frequent lashings and quarrels with his guards. This rebelliousness, though it earned him punishments, also served as an outlet for his frustration and a way to reaffirm his identity in an environment that sought to subjugate him. Every punishment, every humiliation, every scene of brutality witnessed did not break him but hardened him, fueling a burning desire for power and vengeance. He learned that to survive and rule in such a merciless world, one had to be even more merciless. The Ottoman court, with its bureaucratic efficiency and well-organized war machine, also taught him the importance of discipline and order. Vlad observed how a vast empire was kept under control by a combination of force, rigid laws, and an implacable hierarchy. He saw the logic behind calculated cruelty. It eliminated opposition and subjugated the populace, ensuring submission. Thus, the forging of the tyrant occurred not only through exposure to horror, but through the absorption of the oppressor's tactics. Vlad did not just witness brutality. He studied it, internalized it, and transformed it into his own philosophy of governance. He would emerge from captivity, not as a broken man, but as a predator, ready to use the very weapons that imprisoned him to dominate his own realm. The experience of Ottoman captivity, though shared by Vlad III and his younger brother, Radu, led to diametrically opposed paths and temperaments, a contrast that would prove decisive in their destinies and in the history of Wallachia. Both were taken as hostages, both exposed to the culture and methods of the Ottoman court, but their reactions and adaptations could not have been more distinct. This fundamental difference would forge two men with antagonistic worldviews and loyalties, culminating in a fratricidal conflict for the throne. Radu the Handsome, as he became known, was Vlad's antithesis. Younger and perhaps more pliable, he adapted remarkably well to life at the Ottoman court. His physical beauty, natural charisma, and ability to quickly assimilate Turkish language, customs, and culture allowed him to ascend within the palace hierarchy. Radu not only accepted his new reality, but flourished within it. He converted to Islam, a pragmatic decision that sealed his integration and secured him the favor of the powerful. Accounts indicate that Radu became a close confidant and even a personal favorite of Mehmed II, the crown prince who would become the great conqueror of Constantinople. This proximity to the future sultan granted Radu a position of influence and security within the empire, but it irrevocably distanced him from his Wallachian roots and his brother. Vlad, on the other hand, cultivated a deep and silent hatred for his captive status and his captors. The luxurious and disciplined environment of the Ottoman court failed to break his defiant spirit. Turkish accounts, which describe him as infinitely troublesome and insolent, attest to his intrinsic resistance. Vlad refused to bow, and every lashing, every quarrel with his guards, every scene of terror he witnessed only fueled his inner fury. While Radu saw adaptation as a means of survival and ascent, Vlad viewed it as betrayal. He did not seek to please his captors. He studied them, observed their weaknesses, and absorbed their tactics, not to blindly imitate them, but to one day use them against them. This dichotomy between the brothers would become a central theme in Wallachian history. Radu would represent the path of submission and alliance with Ottoman power, a peace, however precarious, in exchange for vassalage. Vlad, in turn, would embody fierce resistance, the pursuit of independence at any cost, even if it meant plunging the land into rivers of blood. The contrast between the handsome and the impaler was not just a matter of personality, but of ideology and destiny. One became the instrument of Ottoman domination, the other its greatest scourge, both shaped by the same captivity, but with drastically different outcomes. This rivalry, born in the gilded dungeons of Adrianople, would culminate in a struggle for control of Wallachia that would pit brother against brother. The life of Vlad II Dracula, father of the future Impaler, was a constant political juggling act, a risky game of alliances and betrayals amidst the incessant pressure between the Kingdom of Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. In 1447, this precarious dance came to a brutal and bloody end, with devastating consequences for young Vlad III, still a hostage in Turkish lands. Instability in Wallachia was chronic, with the boyars, the powerful local landowning nobility, constantly conspiring to depose the voivode in favor of candidates who would better serve their own interests or those of foreign powers. Vlad II Dracula, who attempted to maintain Wallachia in an almost impossible balance between the two titans, committed what would prove to be a fatal error. He vacillated between loyalty to the Hungarians, who represented the hope of a Christian crusade, and paying tribute to the Ottomans, who promised temporary peace. At a crucial moment, Sultan Mehmed II demanded that Vlad II join Ottoman attacks against Transylvania, which would mean a Christian prince attacking other Christians. This action enraged John Hunyadi, the legendary Hungarian general and voivode of Transylvania, who had previously been an ally of Vlad II. The trust between the two was irrevocably broken. Meanwhile, young Vlad and Radu remained as hostages in the Ottoman court, their lives hanging by a thread. Vlad II's decision to continue aiding Hunyadi against the Turks, effectively abandoning his sons to the Sultan's mercy, was a betrayal that would haunt Vlad III forever. In a poignant letter to Transylvania, Vlad II sought to justify his painful choice. "Please understand me. I left my young sons to be slaughtered for Christian peace, so that I and my country might be subjects of our king and join you." This declaration reveals a father's desperation, but for Vlad III, it would be proof of abandonment and betrayal. Vlad II's political calculation was to protect his royal lineage through his eldest son, Mircea, whom he had left in Wallachia. However, this strategy crumbled in 1447. After a crushing defeat at the Battle of Varna in 1444, where the Wallachians helped Hunyadi escape, John Hunyadi, resentful and seeking to eliminate rivals, allied himself with the Wallachian boyars, who viewed Vlad II as an unstable ruler. Together, they orchestrated the assassinations of Vlad II Dracula and his son Mircea. The manner of Mircea's death was particularly horrifying, a prelude to the brutality that would come to define Vlad III's era. His eyes were burned with hot pokers before he was buried alive. Vlad II was captured and executed, possibly hanged or impaled, although the exact details vary. All of this transpired while young Vlad III remained a prisoner in Turkey, powerless to prevent the annihilation of his family. This series of betrayals by his father, who abandoned him, by Hunyadi, who murdered his family, and by the boyars, who collaborated in their deaths, would profoundly shape Vlad III's worldview. He would learn that loyalty was fleeting, and that trust was a dangerous luxury, fueling an insatiable thirst for vengeance against all who had caused the ruin of his lineage. Following the brutal annihilation of his family in 1447, Vlad III's life, then at 17 years old, stood at a crossroads. Hardened by 5 years of captivity in the Ottoman court and consumed by a burning desire for revenge, he now represented the last direct link to the Draculist lineage. Sultan Mehmed II, who had become the new Ottoman ruler, saw an opportunity in Vlad. Far from an act of clemency, Vlad's release by the Turks in 1448 was a calculated strategic maneuver. The Sultan hoped to install a loyal ruler in Wallachia, a puppet who would ensure the principality's obedience and serve Ottoman interests, especially after the elimination of Vlad II Dracula and Mircea, who had flirted with the Hungarians. In contrast to Vlad, his brother Radu decided to remain at the Ottoman court, where he had found favor and risen in status, solidifying his loyalty to the Turks. This divergence in the brothers' paths laid the groundwork for a future fratricidal conflict and an ideological watershed for Wallachia. Mehmed II offered Vlad III minimal support, but enough for him to make his first attempt to reclaim his father's throne. This was an opportunity Vlad seized eagerly, driven by the memory of the atrocities against his family and the ambition to restore his lineage. With Ottoman backing, Vlad invaded Wallachia. However, this initial thrust was an ephemeral flash of power, a brief taste of what his rule would become, but still lacking the strength to sustain itself. He managed to depose Prince Vladislav II, who had been imposed by the Hungarians after the death of Vlad II Dracula. This initial victory, though small in scale, was significant for Vlad, as it represented the first step in his revenge against those who had betrayed his family and his country. He was crowned voivode, but his reign was precarious and extremely short, lasting only 2 months. Wallachia was a powder keg, with boyar factions loyal to the Hungarians still powerful, and the influence of John Hunyadi, the Hungarian general who orchestrated the deaths of his father and brother, still prevalent in the region. The lack of significant Hungarian support for Vlad, coupled with the distrust of the Wallachian boyars themselves who feared his Ottoman-imposed ascent, made his position untenable. Forces loyal to Hunyadi and anti-Ottoman nobles soon reorganized and, in a swift counterattack, overthrew Vlad from the throne. He was forced to flee again, going into exile to avoid capture and death. This brief experience, however, was crucial. It confirmed to Vlad the volatility of power and the need for more drastic methods to consolidate his authority and ensure loyalty. The fact that he had been installed by the Ottomans made him unpopular among many who yearned for independence, and the speed with which he was deposed showed him that external support on its own was insufficient. This first failed attempt served as a painful lesson that true power in Wallachia lay not just in external alliances, but in the ability to crush internal opposition and impose an unyielding will upon the realm. Vlad fled, but not to hide. He fled to learn and eventually to return with even greater fury. After the abrupt fall of his first ephemeral reign in 1448, Vlad III was forced into a new period of exile and learning, far from the Wallachian throne. These years, which spanned almost a decade, were crucial for the consolidation of his philosophy of governance and for the formation of his strategy for returning to power. It was not a passive exile, but a period of observation, networking, and the refinement of his skills, both military and political. Initially, Vlad sought refuge in Moldavia, where his uncle Bogdan II ruled. There, he spent a few years, observing the complex political dynamics of the region and the relationship between Moldavia, Hungary, and the Ottomans. Moldavia, like Wallachia, was constantly under threat from major powers, and Vlad had the opportunity to see how other rulers attempted to navigate this intricate web of alliances and conflicts. However, this phase of relative security was interrupted in 1451. With the assassination of his uncle Bogdan II, the event forced Vlad to move again, reinforcing the lesson that political instability was a constant and that trust was a dangerous luxury. After his uncle's death, Vlad fled to the Kingdom of Hungary, the very kingdom that, through its general John Hunyadi, had orchestrated the deaths of his father and brother. This decision, which at first glance might seem contradictory, demonstrates Vlad's cunning and pragmatism. He knew that to reclaim Wallachia, he would need military and political support, and Hunyadi, despite his history, was one of the most powerful figures in Central Europe and a fierce enemy of the Ottomans. In Hungary, Vlad not only sought shelter but also learned Hungarian military tactics. Renowned for their discipline and effectiveness, he studied heavy cavalry, artillery, and defensive strategies, elements he would later integrate into his own style of warfare. Furthermore, Vlad continued to hone his leadership and diplomatic skills, even if his diplomacy was often tinged with an aura of intimidation. He observed closely how European courts functioned, how alliances were formed and dissolved, and the fragility of promises. During these years, Vlad also deepened his understanding of the psychology of fear. Having experienced terror firsthand as a hostage, he grasped the power of intimidation as a tool to control both enemies and subjects. He not only absorbed military and political knowledge, but also the art of manipulating human emotions for his own ends. Exile was, for Vlad, a period of incubation. He wasn't merely waiting for his opportunity. He was preparing, sharpening his skills, cultivating his network of contacts, and refining the brutal philosophy that would make him famous. He emerged from this period as a more calculating, more ruthless, and more determined leader than ever to reclaim what he considered his by-right and to exact vengeance upon those who had betrayed him. Every court he visited, every twist in his journey, added a layer to the complex and dark personality that would come to rule Wallachia. The decade of exile and learning culminated in 1456, with Vlad III's decisive move to reclaim the Wallachian throne, this time definitively and with unyielding determination. At 25 years old, Vlad was no longer the inexperienced youth who had been easily deposed. He had transformed into a shrewd strategist, a leader hardened by adversity, and a relentless warrior, ready to impose his will upon unstable Wallachia. The stage was set for his ascent. Tension between the Kingdom of Hungary and the Ottoman Empire reached a new peak, especially with the imminent Ottoman threat to Belgrade, a strategic Hungarian fortress. John Hunyadi, the Hungarian regent and former tormentor of Vlad's family, ironically found himself in a position where he needed a strong, anti-Ottoman ruler in Wallachia. Though distrustful of Vlad due to his past with the Turks, Hunyadi recognized his ferocity and military experience. Vlad, in turn, capitalized on Hungary's need, presenting himself as the only viable option to stem the Ottoman advance on the frontier. With John Hunyadi's tactical support, who, it should be noted, would die shortly after Vlad's conquest, a victim of the plague, ending an era and leaving Vlad with more freedom of action, Vlad III launched his offensive against Wallachia. The throne was then occupied by Vladislav II, the same individual who had usurped his father's power and had deposed him during his first attempt. Chronicles of the time, though at times exaggerated, describe Vlad's conquest as a feat of martial prowess and determination. Vlad's armies and Vladislav II's clashed in a decisive confrontation. According to some accounts, the battle culminated in a single combat between the two voivodes, a scene worthy of the most epic medieval legends. Vlad III, with his already notorious ferocity, supposedly defeated and killed Vladislav II in single combat. While the exact veracity of this duel is debated among historians, the story serves to underscore the image Vlad projected, that of a leader who was always at the forefront of battle, leading his men with courage and brutality, rather than commanding from the rear. This display of martial prowess and the defeat of his enemy allowed Vlad to assume full control of the country. His victory was not merely military, it was a declaration of intent. He had returned not only to rule, but to seek revenge and to impose a new order, based on iron discipline and terror. Wallachia, exhausted by years of instability and betrayals, was ready for a ruler who, however brutal, would bring stability, and Vlad was more than ready to deliver it. His second reign began, and with it, the darkest and most notable era in Wallachian history, where the name Impaler would acquire its most macabre meaning. If this epic story has captivated you and you want more content like this, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos. Your help is essential to spread knowledge and explore the depths of history. And for us to know where this force comes from, tell us in the comments what city or country you are watching from. Once in power in 1456, Vlad III wasted no time in consolidating his authority, and more importantly, in executing his cold and calculated vengeance against those he held responsible for his father's and brother's deaths, and for the instability that plagued Wallachia, the powerful boyars. These nobles, with their intrigues and volatile alliances with foreign powers, were, in Vlad's view, the root of his principality's weakness. The event that would seal the fate of many of them would be one of the most infamous and brutal of his reign, an Easter banquet that would transform into a massacre. On Easter Sunday of 1459, though some sources point to other dates, Vlad summoned the principal boyars of Wallachia, along with their families, to a grand feast at his princely residence in Târgoviște, the capital of Wallachia. Easter, a day of religious celebration and forgiveness, would serve as a cruel irony for what was to come. The banquet began with an atmosphere of apparent celebration. Wine flowed freely, and the nobles, relaxed in the presence of their young ruler, indulged in the festivities. However, Vlad had carefully orchestrated every detail of what would become a meticulous trap. As the night progressed and spirits rose, Vlad called for silence and began to question his guests with a seemingly innocent inquiry, yet one laden with an unspoken threat. "How many voivodes have you seen in your lives?" The question hung in the air, creating confused silence. One elder, perhaps the most audacious or naive, replied, claiming to have seen 30 rulers come and go. Vlad moved through the hall, posing the same question to young and old. The answers varied. 7, said a younger boyar. Dozens, claimed others. Some admitted they had lost count. An elderly noble, perhaps to flatter, even dared to reference Vlad's ancestors, mentioning that he had seen no less than 20 voivodes since his grandfather's time. While the nobles, unaware of the tightening net, responded, Vlad's men, following precise orders, locked the doors from the outside. What followed is a testament to Vlad's calculated ruthlessness. His soldiers stormed the hall and acted with brutal swiftness. Boyars who resisted were quickly subdued. Vlad then divided his captives into two groups, based on their physical capacity: those young and strong enough for labor, and those too old or infirm to work. The younger nobles, along with their wives and children, were forced on an arduous march of 50 miles, about 80 kilometers, to the ruins of his castle at Poenari. There, they would be compelled to rebuild the fortress stone by stone, under the whip and the threat of death. Many succumbed to exhaustion and starvation during this forced labor. The elderly nobles and their families, deemed useless for manual labor, met an even more horrific fate. They were impaled on stakes outside the princely residence in Targoviste, their bodies left to rot and serve as food for vultures. These victims became the first additions to what would become known as Vlad's infamous Forest of the Impaled, a grim and unforgettable warning of the price of betrayal. This act was not merely personal revenge. It was a declaration of absolute power and the beginning of a new era of terror and order in Wallachia. The fortress of Poenari, a medieval castle now lying in dramatic ruins atop a steep cliff in the Carpathians, is more than a mere stone construction. It is a grim monument to Vlad III's brutality and unbreakable will. After the infamous Easter banquet, where the treacherous boyars were subdued, the reconstruction of this castle became a central project in Vlad's consolidation of power and a symbol of his calculated cruelty. The original ruins of Poenari, dating back to the mid-13th century, were little more than an abandoned shell when Vlad ordered their reconstruction. He saw it not only as a strategic defensive position, given its almost impregnable location in the Argeș River Valley, but as a project of humiliation and control. The younger and physically capable nobles who had survived the initial purge were forced to march 50 miles to the site, along with their families, and there they were subjected to forced labor. Under the relentless supervision of Vlad's guards, these once proud boyars, accustomed to luxury and political intrigue, were reduced to mere manual laborers. They were forced to carry stones, timber, and other materials up the mountain, often in adverse weather conditions and with meager provisions. The work was incessant and punitive. Many succumbed to exhaustion, disease, and hunger, their bodies unceremoniously discarded. The idea was not only to punish, but to break the spirit of the nobility, demonstrating that no one was above the prince's will. The choice of Poenari for this forced reconstruction was no accident. Its remote and difficult-to-access location made it a natural prison and a perfect site for imposing such strenuous labor. The legendary 1,480 steps leading to the mountaintop, a count that many pilgrims still attempt to conquer today, are a silent testament to the superhuman effort demanded of those captives. With every stone laid, every wall erected, Vlad was not only building a fortress, but also dismantling the autonomy of the boyars and solidifying his own absolute power. Poenari became one of Vlad's favorite strongholds, serving as one of his main residences, and a strategic point for observation and defense against threats, both internal and external. Its elevated position offered a panoramic view of vast areas of Wallachia, allowing Vlad to monitor movements and, in a way, impose his presence upon the land. For the common people, Poenari became an ambivalent symbol, a reminder of the terror awaiting traitors, but also a representation of the strength and stability Vlad imposed on a previously chaotic realm. The legend of Poenari is complex, including stories of secret tunnels and escape passages used by Vlad in times of siege. While many of these stories are folklore, the fact remains that the castle stood as a testament to Vlad's ability to transform humiliation into power, and his unwavering belief that obedience could only be forged through the most brutal discipline. The fortress of Poenari, in its silent ruins, still whispers the story of a prince who used stone and forced labor to etch his will onto the landscape and into the memory of his people. Among Vlad III's calculated acts of vengeance, a particularly grim and emotionally charged moment was the exhumation of his older brother, Mircea. This event, which occurred sometime after the massacre of the boyars at Easter in 1459, was not an act of pity or mourning, but a search for confirmation and a new surge of fury in his already burning thirst for retribution. Mircea, the firstborn son of Vlad II Dracula, had been brutally murdered by the Wallachian boyars, with the Hungarian complicity of John Hunyadi in 1447. The manner of his death, already feared by Vlad, was excruciatingly cruel. His eyes had been burned with hot pokers before he was buried alive. For Vlad, who had spent years in Ottoman captivity, powerless to protect his family, the memory of this betrayal and his brother's horrifying death weighed heavily. Although he had already punished many of the boyars involved, the exhumation represented a need to confront the raw truth, to physically touch the outcome of that betrayal. It was a way to reaffirm the justification for his own extreme methods. The scene of the exhumation, though not detailed in all chronicles, would certainly have been a moment of great psychological impact for Vlad. Upon unearthing Mircea's body, its position buried face down, a posture indicating he had been placed alive in the grave, confirmed Vlad's worst fears. This discovery was not just a validation of the truth, but a catalyst for an even greater fury. Seeing undeniable proof of his beloved brother's agony, the last hours of suffocation and despair transformed Vlad's personal pain into an even firmer resolve for vengeance. This moment of confrontation with Mircea's death served to cement in Vlad's mind the belief that benevolence and mercy were dangerous weaknesses. The betrayal by the boyars, the cowardice of the Hungarian allies, and the brutality of Mircea's death solidified his conviction that only absolute terror could guarantee loyalty and prevent future conspiracies. His acts of cruelty were not merely acts of power. They were, for Vlad, a form of justice, direct retribution for the pain and humiliation his family had endured. The exhumation of Mircea, therefore, is not a mere macabre detail in Vlad's biography. It is an emotional turning point that reinforces his ideology of terror. From this moment onward, every impalement, every exemplary punishment, every act of cruelty he orchestrated would carry not only the weight of a political strategy, but also the reverberation of that horrifying vision. Vlad's thirst for vengeance was not just political, it was visceral, fueled by the indelible image of his brother, buried alive, and this image would haunt him, justifying his darkest actions. Vlad III's figure became intrinsically linked to the method of execution that earned him the name the Impaler. Far from being a random act of sadism, impalement was, for Vlad, a carefully calibrated instrument of exemplary justice and psychological terror, a fundamental tool to impose his iron will upon a principality plagued by corruption and disorder. His Forest of the Impaled was not a scene of indiscriminate slaughter, but a macabre gallery of warnings, each body a silent lesson. After consolidating his power, Vlad systematically employed impalement to punish a wide range of transgressions: traitors, insubordinate nobles, common criminals, thieves, robbers, dishonest merchants, and even those perceived as potential threats to his rule. All could face the stake. The choice of impalement rather than quicker methods like beheading or hanging was deliberate. The slow, agonizing death with the victim publicly exposed for days served as a horrifying spectacle that terrorized the population and deterred any form of disobedience. The stakes, which varied in size and angle, were often prepared to prolong suffering. In some cases, the stake was rounded and greased to penetrate the body without causing immediate death by vital organ damage, ensuring prolonged agony as gravity did its work. Victims were often impaled anally, but could also be impaled through the abdomen, chest, or even transversely. The bodies were then erected in various positions, creating a landscape of horror that stretched for kilometers around cities and along Wallachia's main roads. Vlad's objective was clear: to create an atmosphere of paralyzing fear that would eliminate crime and treason. He believed that exemplary public punishment was the only way to ensure order in a society he considered corrupt and disloyal. For Vlad, justice was not merely about punishing the guilty, but about terrifying the observer into never even considering committing the same mistake. This brutality, paradoxically, brought unprecedented stability and security to Wallachia. Roads once infested with bandits became safe, theft drastically decreased, and obedience to the prince's laws became the norm. The populace, though terrified, often acknowledged that this cruelty brought a form of order they had never experienced under weaker rulers. The Forest of the Impaled was, therefore, more than an improvised graveyard. It was a political declaration and a system of social control. Every body was a living or dead reminder of Vlad's unwavering will, a silent sermon on the consequences of disobedience. This instrument of justice not only shaped Vlad's reputation for posterity, but also transformed Wallachia into a realm where the law, however cruel its application, was absolute. Vlad III's justice in Wallachia was an inexorable force, operating with the precision of an executioner and the ruthlessness of a storm. Far from being a system based on complex legal codes or nuanced culpability, the order imposed by Vlad was simple, direct, and above all, terrifying. He believed that exemplary and immediate punishment was the only effective way to eradicate crime and disloyalty in a realm that, before his ascent, had been a cesspool of chaos and corruption. One of the most emblematic examples of this relentless justice is the story of the Golden Chalice in the central square of Târgoviște, the Wallachian capital. Legend has it that Vlad ordered a large, valuable golden chalice to be placed beside a fountain in the city's main square. This chalice was available for any thirsty traveler to drink from, but the instruction was clear. It was to remain untouched, unsupervised, day and night. Most remarkably, throughout Vlad's reign, the chalice was never stolen. This anecdote, though perhaps embellished by time, perfectly illustrates the effectiveness of the terror Vlad imposed. The punishment for theft was so severe and notorious, usually impalement, that the mere thought of disobeying the prince was enough to deter any criminal intent. The message was crystal clear. In his Wallachia, the law would be enforced with lethal consequences. Another story, revealing Vlad's cunning and cruelty, involved a foreign merchant who arrived in Wallachia with a cart full of valuable goods. Worried about thieves, the merchant approached Vlad to ask where he could safely store his wares overnight. Vlad assured him that his realm was completely safe, telling him to leave everything in the middle of the town square without guards. The skeptical merchant obeyed. The next morning, the merchant returned and found everything as he had left it, except for a bag of gold that had mysteriously disappeared. Vlad immediately ordered a search of the city. When the thief was found, he was quickly nailed to a stake in the square. But Vlad wasn't finished. He presented the merchant with a new bag of gold containing an extra coin and insisted that the merchant count it. When the merchant found the extra coin and reported it, Vlad nodded in approval. The moral of the story: if the merchant had kept silent about the extra coin, he too would have been impaled as a thief, as that would indicate he was willing to steal from the prince. Even religious figures were not safe from Vlad's justice. When some monks from a nearby monastery visited his castle, one of them had the misfortune to gag at the smell of decomposing bodies impaled along the road. Vlad asked if something was wrong, and the foolish monk complained about the offensive odor, requesting they speak elsewhere. In response, Vlad impaled him on an extra tall stake, saying that now he would be high enough above the other corpses to breathe fresh air and be free from the stench. This story, while possibly apocryphal, illustrates Vlad's inflexibility and his view that even the slightest complaint, if seen as a criticism or disrespect to his order, could be punished by death. These examples demonstrate that Vlad's justice was not merely about retribution, but about the establishment of a regime of absolute order through absolute fear. Theft, lies, treason, or even the slightest insubordination were viewed as threats to the stability of his realm, and therefore warranted the most brutal punishments. Paradoxically, Vlad's Wallachia became one of the safest places to travel in Europe, provided one respected without question the Impaler's iron law. Vlad III's fury was not confined to Wallachian boyars or internal criminals. It extended with relentless ferocity to the Saxon cities of Transylvania. These communities, established by German settlers since the 12th century, were not mere villages, but rich, fortified commercial centers, such as Sibiu, Hermannstadt, Brașov, Kronstadt, and Sachel, Siebenbürgen. They had close economic and political ties with the Wallachian boyars, and many boyars who survived Vlad's purges had fled there, seeking refuge and, crucially, conspiring against his rule. Vlad knew he could not tolerate these potential threats thriving beyond his borders. The conflict with the Transylvanian Saxons had multiple layers. In addition to harboring his political enemies, the Saxons grew wealthy through trade, using Wallachia as a corridor for their commercial routes with Constantinople and the Ottomans. They were accustomed to operating with considerable freedom and dictating their own trade agreements within Wallachian territory, an arrangement Vlad was determined to dismantle. His vision of total control did not permit such cross-border economic and political autonomy. In 1457, Vlad launched his first attack against Sibiu, where his half-brother Vlad the Monk, Vlad Odica, resided, being another potential rival for the throne. Vlad rode at the head of his army, allegedly with 20,000 men, though this number is likely exaggerated, burning and impaling everything in his path. This initial incursion was merely a prelude. From 1459, Vlad intensified his campaign, unleashing a wave of sustained terror in southern Transylvania, targeting the Saxon cities of Brasov and Sachele. His army descended the Carpathians like a vengeful force, burning crops, capturing civilians, and conducting mass executions. In Brasov, he rode to St. James's Chapel, ordering the suburbs to be burned and the populace impaled at the foot of the mountains. Ever theatrical in his cruelty, Vlad set up a table among his dying victims and ate his breakfast while they suffered, an act that would become one of the most iconic and disturbing images of his tyranny. His methods became increasingly elaborate and horrifying. Accounts from the period state that in certain localities, he had people shredded, like cabbage, with swords and knives. He reportedly ordered the construction of a large copper cauldron with a wooden lid perforated with holes, where victims were placed inside, their heads forced through the holes, and then boiled alive. From Făgăraș, he brought men, women, and children back to Wallachia for impalement. The numbers of victims, though likely exaggerated in contemporary accounts, some speak of 30,000 dead in Amlaș alone, which was impossible given the town's population, indicate the scale of the terror. Others speak of 300 children of fleeing parents being burned or nailed. While numerical precision is debatable, the brutality of the acts themselves is well documented, confirmed by various German and Wallachian chronicles of the time. These campaigns were not merely punitive, they were an unequivocal demonstration that Vlad would not tolerate opposition, even from beyond his borders, and that anyone who conspired against him would suffer the most terrible consequences. The terror in the Saxon cities cemented Vlad's image as a relentless monster in the West. Vlad III's reputation was built not only on brutal historical facts, but also on a profusion of tales and legends that circulated throughout Europe, especially through German pamphlets that described his atrocities in graphic detail. These accounts, though often exaggerated to shock and horrify, were fundamental in consolidating his image as one of history's most sadistic and cruel rulers, transforming him from a Wallachian prince into an almost mythical figure of terror. The methods of torture and execution attributed to Vlad went far beyond impalement, which was horrific enough on its own. The pamphlets, printed with woodcut illustrations visualizing the horror, depicted scenes of unimaginable cruelty. It was alleged that Vlad had people boiled alive in large cauldrons, as previously mentioned in the topic on Saxon terror, where victims were placed inside with their heads protruding from holes in the lid, and then the water was heated to boiling. Other accounts spoke of victims being slowly roasted on spits, like animals on a rotisserie, or flayed alive, their skin hung as macabre trophies. The sadistic creativity attributed to Vlad knew no bounds. There are stories that he forced parents to eat their own children and husbands to eat their wives' breasts, a level of depravity that sought not only physical death, but the moral and psychological annihilation of his victims. Other tales mention the construction of secret trapdoors in his castles that dropped victims directly onto strategically placed stakes below, ensuring an instantaneously grotesque end. Beyond direct violence, the legends also detailed his coldness and indifference to suffering. The image of Vlad setting up a table and eating his breakfast amidst a forest of impaled bodies is one of the most vivid and disturbing examples. This scene, repeated in various chronicles, underscored not only his cruelty but his ability to dehumanize his victims and to find a sinister tranquility amidst the horror. He not only inflicted death, but reveled in the public display of agony. While modern historians question the veracity of every detail of these stories, many believe that the essence of the brutality and exemplary punishment was real and deliberate. Vlad used these narratives and the public executions themselves to instill such profound fear that disobedience became unthinkable. The proliferation of these pamphlets, especially in Germany, transformed Vlad from a relatively unknown Wallachian prince into a demonic figure for Western Europe. This legendary brutality, though exaggerated, served a dual purpose. On one hand, it solidified his image as a bloodthirsty tyrant, and on the other, it helped justify opposition to him from Western rulers who viewed his methods as excessive and inhumane, even by the standards of the time. Thus, Vlad the Impaler became more than a man. He became an archetype of terror, a figure whose name merged with myth, paving the way for his eventual transformation into one of the most iconic villains in world literature. Vlad III's diplomacy with the Ottoman Empire, always tense, was a dangerous dance of defiance and calculation. In 1459, this tension escalated into one of the most famous and emblematically audacious incidents of his reign, an event that would demonstrate his complete disregard for the Sultan's authority and his preference for terror as a form of communication. Wallachia, historically, had paid tribute to the Ottomans, a form of vassalage that guaranteed a often unstable peace in exchange for submission. This tribute was not merely monetary. It included valuable goods like cattle and grain, essential to sustain the vast Ottoman army and capital. But the most humiliating and painful part of the tribute was the delivery of boys, who would be taken to be raised as janissaries, the elite infantry troops of the Sultan, forced to convert to Islam and fight against their own peoples of origin. For Vlad, who had experienced the bitter reality of being a hostage in the Ottoman court, the idea of handing over his people's future, their own youth, to become soldiers for his enemy was unbearable. It was a form of emasculation of his nation, a guarantee that Wallachia would remain eternally subservient. His refusal to pay this tribute, especially the human portion, was not merely a financial matter. It was a declaration of sovereignty and an act of direct defiance to Sultan Mehmed II. Mehmed II, the conqueror, who had overthrown the walls of Constantinople in 1453 and proclaimed himself emperor of the world, could not tolerate such insubordination from a small principality. Wallachia was strategically vital, a corridor between the Danube and the Carpathians, and a potential staging ground for future Ottoman campaigns into Central Europe. Vlad's disobedience was not just a matter of lost revenue, but a risk to the empire's reputation and security. A rebellious vassal, especially one with Vlad's reputation, could incite other revolts. The Sultan's initial response was an attempted trap, as seen in the Hamza Beg incident. But when Vlad exposed and executed the envoys and their troops, open war became inevitable. In an audacious move that shocked even his enemies, Vlad did not wait for the Ottoman invasion. He crossed the Danube into Ottoman territory in 1461 to 1462, launching a series of devastating attacks. Vlad cut a path of destruction throughout the region along the southern banks of the Danube. From Giurgiu to the river's mouth at the Black Sea, settlements, ports, fortresses, and towns in his path were sacked and burned. He indiscriminately slaughtered soldiers, men, women, elderly, and children, making no distinction between combatants and civilians. In a notorious letter to Hungarian Emperor Matthias Corvinus dated February 10, 1462, Vlad coldly declared, "I have broken the peace with this sinister announcement." To prove the scale of his atrocities and his defiance, he sent the emperor a sack containing the heads, noses, and ears of his Turkish enemies, detailing the exact number of dead. "I have killed peasants, men and women, old and young, from where the Danube flows into the sea up to Rus, 23,984 Turks, not counting those we burned in houses or whose heads were cut off by our soldiers." This incursion into Ottoman territory was an act of unprecedented audacity, a direct punch to the Sultan's face. Vlad was not just refusing to be a vassal, he was taking the war directly to the enemy's heart, turning the border into hell and forcing the Sultan to react with all his might. This escalation of violence marked the beginning of one of the 15th century's greatest confrontations between the Ottoman Empire and a European ruler. The affront to the Ottoman envoys in 1459, with their turbans nailed to their heads, was a foreshadowing, but Vlad III's true declaration of war against the Ottoman Empire came through an act of economic and military rebellion, the complete cessation of the annual tribute. Since his ascent, Wallachia had formerly been a vassal state of the Ottomans, obliged to pay a heavy tribute that was not limited to money. It included valuable goods like cattle and grain, essential to sustain the vast Ottoman army and capital. But the most humiliating and painful part of the tribute was the delivery of boys, who would be taken to be raised as janissaries, the elite infantry troops of the Sultan, forced to convert to Islam and fight against their own peoples of origin. For Vlad, who had experienced the bitter reality of being a hostage in the Ottoman court, the idea of handing over his people's future, their own youth, to become soldiers for his enemy was unbearable. It was a form of emasculation of his nation, a guarantee that Wallachia would remain eternally subservient. His refusal to pay this tribute, especially the human portion, was not just a financial matter. It was a declaration of sovereignty and an act of direct defiance to Sultan Mehmed II. Mehmed II, the conqueror, who had overthrown the walls of Constantinople and dreamed of extending his empire throughout Europe, could not tolerate such insubordination from a small principality. Wallachia was strategically vital, a corridor between the Danube and the Carpathians, and a potential staging ground for future Ottoman campaigns into Central Europe. Vlad's disobedience was not just a matter of lost revenue, but a risk to the empire's reputation and security. A rebellious vassal, especially one with Vlad's reputation, could incite other revolts. The Sultan's initial response was an attempted trap, as seen in the Hamza Beg incident. But when Vlad exposed and executed the envoys and their troops, open war became inevitable. In an audacious move that shocked even his enemies, Vlad did not wait for the Ottoman invasion. He crossed the Danube into Ottoman territory in 1461-1462, launching a series of devastating attacks. Vlad cut a path of destruction throughout the region along the southern banks of the Danube, from Giurgiu to the river's mouth at the Black Sea. Settlements, ports, fortresses, and towns in his path were sacked and burned. He indiscriminately slaughtered soldiers, men, women, elderly, and children, making no distinction between combatants and civilians. In a notorious letter to Hungarian Emperor Matthias Corvinus, dated February 10, 1462, Vlad coldly declared, "I have broken the peace with this sinister announcement." To prove the scale of his atrocities and his defiance, he sent the emperor a sack containing the heads, noses, and ears of his Turkish enemies, detailing the exact number of dead. "I have killed peasants, men and women, old and young, from where the Danube flows into the sea up to Rus, 23,184 Turks, not counting those we burned in houses or whose heads were cut off by our soldiers." This incursion into Ottoman territory was an act of unprecedented audacity, a direct punch to the Sultan's face. Vlad was not just refusing to be a vassal, he was taking the war directly to the enemy's heart, turning the border into hell and forcing the Sultan to react with all his might. This escalation of violence marked the beginning of one of the 15th century's greatest confrontations between the Ottoman Empire and a European ruler. With open war declared by the Ottoman Empire, Vlad III knew that a direct confrontation against the vastness and military might of the Turks would be suicidal. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, was preparing a colossal force, possibly the largest seen in Europe since the Crusades, to crush the Wallachian rebellion. Faced with this overwhelming threat, Vlad implemented a defensive strategy as brutal as it was ingenious: the scorched earth policy. It was not a simple retreat, but a calculated devastation designed to transform Wallachia into an uninhabitable hell for any invading army. Vlad's scorched earth strategy consisted of denying the Ottomans all essential resources needed to sustain their advance. In a vast area stretching from the banks of the Danube, particularly between Vidin and Targoviste, the capital, he ordered the complete destruction of everything that could be useful to the enemy. First, wells were poisoned or contaminated, depriving troops and animals of potable water. Weeds and poisonous plants were often mixed into the water, and in some accounts, even corpses were thrown in to ensure contamination. Next, crops in the fields were systematically burned, transforming fertile landscapes into ash and smoke. Barns were set ablaze, and supplies of grain and food were destroyed or moved to secure hiding places in the mountains. The goal was to create an artificial scarcity of food so severe that the enormous Ottoman army, accustomed to living off the land as it advanced, would be forced to rely on long and vulnerable supply lines. The civilian population was also an integral part of this strategy. Vlad ordered the total evacuation of areas that the Ottoman army would pass through. Residents were instructed to hide in the dense swamps, the impenetrable forests of the Carpathians, and the most remote mountainous regions of Wallachia. Along with them, all cattle and livestock that could be moved were hidden. Those animals that could not be transported, horses, sheep, cattle, were slaughtered and left in the sun to rot, creating a desolate landscape of decaying carcasses that not only reeked of death, but could also spread disease and demoralize the troops. This tactic transformed Wallachian territory into an inhospitable and hostile wasteland. The Ottoman advance, accustomed to rapid marches and easy supply, became painfully slow and exhausting. The lack of adequate food and water, combined with the omnipresent stench of death and the desolate environment, began to wear down the morale and health of the invading army. Every step on Wallachian soil was a challenge, and each day brought more privations and discomfort. In addition to destroying resources, Vlad also used the terrain to his advantage. The dense, ancient oak forests, almost impassable for a large cavalry force, became the perfect hiding place for his guerrilla forces. Ottoman expeditions sent to search for supplies or hunt down Vlad's forces never returned. The Wallachians, knowing every trail and hiding spot, killed every Turkish scout to the last man, depriving the Sultan of crucial information about the enemy and the terrain. Vlad's scorched earth strategy was a masterful stroke of asymmetric warfare, turning the very territory into a deadly weapon against a numerically superior enemy. In June 1462, as the colossal Ottoman army, led by Sultan Mehmed II himself, slowly advanced through Wallachia, devastated by Vlad's scorched earth tactics, the Impaler made his most audacious and desperate move, a massive night attack against the Ottoman camp. It was a maneuver no serious military commander of the era would dare attempt, given Vlad's immense numerical disadvantage. His roughly 30,000 men against the estimated 60,000 to 200,000, numbers vary in sources, Turks. For Vlad, however, there was no interest in a war of attrition he couldn't win. His only hope was a decisive blow that could turn the tide of war. To kill Sultan Mehmed II himself. The darkness of the night offered his only chance. A Serbian chronicler, present in the Turkish camp, left a detailed and chilling account of that fateful night. The usual nightly routine was underway, the clatter of pots being cleaned after dinner, guards pacing back and forth, soldiers chatting quietly as they prepared for sleep. Many complained of the relentless thirst, a result of days without potable water due to Vlad's strategy of poisoning wells. Then, through the dense darkness came the hoot of an owl, followed by another owl signal. Vlad's signal to attack. Chaos erupted instantly. Wallachian forces, known as Vlad's men, rode to the edges of the Ottoman camp, cutting down soldiers randomly before most realized what was happening. Next, Wallachian horsemen carrying torches appeared snaking through the camp, not directly attacking, but using the lights and the sound of horns to disorient and create panic. Vlad's primary objective was clear: to locate and destroy the Sultan's tent. However, in their haste and the darkness, Vlad's forces aimed at the wrong place, completely destroying the tent of 2 Ottoman military viziers and killing their guards. This crucial error cost him his main objective. When Vlad realized his mistake, the true Sultan's tent was already surrounded by a thick formation of Turkish troops, with bristling spears and archers unleashing volleys of arrows, creating an impenetrable barrier. The Wallachians never managed to advance, and the Turks wisely held their defensive position, rather than risking the Sultan's safety by pursuing attackers in a chaotic night environment. Accounts claim that Vlad had arranged for an allied boyar to attack from the opposite side in a pincer movement, but no other force appeared that night, leaving Vlad in an isolated position. In the final hours before dawn, Vlad's men, unable to reach their primary target, began to savagely slaughter the Turkish pack animals. This move, though strategic to diminish their marching capacity, may also have been an expression of pure frustration at his failed assassination attempt. The casualties of this night attack are disputed. Some chroniclers claim minimal losses on both sides, while others report 5,000 to 7,000 Wallachian cavalry and 15,000 Turkish soldiers killed. The lower estimates are likely more accurate, as such devastating losses for Vlad's cavalry force would have effectively ended his ability to resist. Despite not achieving his objective of killing the Sultan, the night attack of Târgoviște was a significant military humiliation for Mehmed II, demonstrating Vlad's daring and unpredictability, and forcing the Sultan to acknowledge that he faced an enemy unlike any other. Vlad's terror and audacity had shaken the morale of the Ottoman army, preparing it for the horror it would encounter next. As the Ottoman forces, staggering and demoralized by Vlad's night attack, continued their slow and exhausting advance towards Târgoviște, the capital of Wallachia, they encountered Vlad's most infamous and terrifying creation, the Forest of the Impaled, or the Valley of the Impaled. This scene of unspeakable horror was not an accident or a remnant of battle. It was a masterpiece of psychological terror meticulously orchestrated by Vlad to break the spirit of his invaders. Stretching for approximately 2 miles in length and 1 mile in width, in a crescent formation around the city, about 20,000 corpses hung on stakes. The number, though possibly an exaggeration by chroniclers to emphasize the impact, reflects the monumental scale of the carnage. The victims were in various stages of decomposition, creating a nightmare landscape that defied any description. Skeletons picked clean by scavengers hung alongside more recent victims, whose bodies still displayed flesh hanging in strips, partially exposed bones, and the pale color of death. Some posts were empty, their horrible burdens having completely decayed, leaving only the stench of death. Details reported by eyewitnesses, or by those who heard the accounts from Turkish soldiers, were a living nightmare. It is said that mothers were impaled beneath their babies on the same stake, an image of horror designed to maximize emotional impact. There are even more graphic accounts of women's breasts being carved out and their babies stuffed into the cavities of their chests. Though the literal veracity of these details is debated, they illustrate the propaganda of terror that circulated. Birds, especially vultures and crows, nested in the hollowed-out torsos of the corpses, and scavengers feasted freely. The stench was unbearable, a sickening mix of decaying flesh, dried blood, and exposed viscera, carried on the wind. The air was heavy with the smell of death, an invitation to nausea and despair for the Ottoman army, already exhausted by the march across scorched earth, by hunger, and by constant harassment from Wallachian guerrillas. This spectacle proved too much. Many soldiers doubled over, vomiting their empty stomachs, convulsing at the sight and smell. The psychological impact of the Forest of the Impaled was devastating. Sultan Mehmed II himself, the conqueror of Constantinople and an iron-willed leader, was shocked by the scene. Upon seeing the Forest of the Impaled, he reportedly uttered the famous phrase, "We cannot take the land of a man who does such things," or, "I will not fight against a man who rules with the dead." While some historians argue that the Ottoman retreat was more due to practical considerations, such as the logistical difficulty of sustaining such a vast army in terrain devastated by Vlad's tactics, the scarcity of supplies, and incessant guerrilla attacks that allowed neither rest nor security, it is undeniable that the horror of Vlad's display certainly achieved its intended effect, undermining the Turkish army's morale and will to fight. Vlad's Forest of the Impaled was not just a military strategy, it was a macabre masterpiece of psychological terror that went down in history as one of the most shocking acts of warfare of all time. The impact of the Forest of the Impaled on the Ottoman army, and crucially on Sultan Mehmed II himself, was profound and decisive. That infernal landscape of 20,000 impaled bodies, stretching for miles around Târgoviște, was not just a grotesque sight. It was a calculated message of terror designed to break the morale of the invader. and to a great extent, it succeeded. Sultan Mehmed II, a ruthless conqueror who had led the capture of Constantinople less than a decade earlier, was known for his iron determination and his ability to overcome military obstacles. However, the scene he encountered in Wallachia left him visibly shaken. Historical sources, including Ottoman chronicles and Western accounts, describe the shock among the Turkish troops. Many soldiers vomited, others refused to advance, and demoralization spread like a plague. The sight of decaying bodies, including women and children, some in positions that suggested tortures beyond impalement, coupled with the nauseating stench and the exhaustion of marching through devastated territory, transformed the proud Ottoman army into a mass of horrified men. Faced with this unprecedented demonstration of cruelty, Mehmed II made a surprising decision. He ordered a retreat. This was not a direct military defeat on an open battlefield, but a strategic withdrawal imposed by psychological terror. While some historians argue that the retreat was motivated by more pragmatic reasons, such as the logistical difficulty of sustaining such a vast army in terrain ravaged by Vlad's tactics, the scarcity of supplies, and incessant guerrilla attacks that allowed neither rest nor security, it is undeniable that the horror of Vlad's display certainly achieved its intended effect, undermining the Turkish army's morale and will to fight. Vlad's Wallachia became a place where death and agony were tools of war, and the territory itself transformed into a weapon. The phrase attributed to the Sultan, "I cannot take the land of a man who does such things," or variations thereof, encapsulates Vlad's impact. For a leader who based his power on force and the ability to inspire dread, confronting an enemy who surpassed his own brutality was a disturbing challenge. Mehmed II was not just dealing with an army. He was dealing with the embodiment of terror. The Ottoman retreat was a significant victory for Vlad, albeit temporary. He had managed to repel the most powerful army in the world at his time, not by numerical superiority, but by a combination of tactical cunning, knowledge of the terrain, and above all, the masterful use of terror as a strategy. This victory solidified his reputation as a fierce defender of Wallachia and Christendom, at least for some of his supporters. However, the Sultan had a final card to play. Mehmed II, cunning in his own political ruthlessness, did not completely abandon Wallachia. Instead, he left behind Vlad's younger brother, Radu the Handsome, who had grown up in the Ottoman court and was completely loyal to the Turks. Radu was accompanied by a contingent of Ottoman troops and, crucially, substantial financial resources. Radu's mission was clear: to undermine support for Vlad from within, offering a peaceful alternative to the brutality and incessant warfare imposed by his brother. This divide-and-conquer strategy would prove more effective than brute force. The Sultan's retreat marked the end of one phase of the conflict, but paved the way for a new and more insidious battle for control of Wallachia. With Sultan Mehmed II's retreat, the Ottoman Empire did not abandon its ambitions for Wallachia. Instead of a full-scale invasion, it opted for a more subtle, yet equally effective strategy: the installation of a puppet ruler. The key player in this chessboard was Radu the Handsome, Vlad III's younger brother. Radu, who had spent 15 years in captivity at the Ottoman court, had a completely different profile from Vlad. His beauty, charisma, and, crucially, his unwavering loyalty to the Ottomans made him the ideal candidate to pacify and control Wallachia. Radu, who converted to Islam and became a favorite of Sultan Mehmed II himself, there are even speculations, though unproven, that he became the Sultan's lover, returned to Wallachia with a contingent of Turkish troops and substantial financial resources. His mission was clear: to approach the Wallachian boyars and the populace, exhausted by Vlad's war and terror, offering an alternative. Radu's proposal was peace with the Ottomans and an end to the constant wars, atrocities, and impalement regime that characterized his brother's rule. The Wallachian population, despite fearing Vlad and often respecting the order he imposed, was exhausted. Years of incessant conflict, scorched earth tactics that impoverished the countryside, and brutal executions that affected both guilty and innocent had taken an immense toll. The fear of the stake, once a deterrent to crime, now mingled with weariness and a desire for normalcy. In this context, Radu's offer of an Ottoman peace, even if it meant submission, sounded appealing to many. Support for Vlad, which was once a mix of fear and loyalty, began to crumble. The boyars, who had been brutally subjugated by Vlad, and many of whom had impaled family members, saw in Radu an opportunity to restore their influence and rid themselves of the tyrant. The promise that the stakes would be pulled down, that trade would be reactivated, and that life would return to a semblance of normalcy without the constant shadow of terror, resonated. Radu's ascent was relatively smooth. He didn't need a major battle. The demoralization and weariness of the Wallachian people, combined with the cunning of Ottoman diplomacy and Radu's peaceful appeal, were sufficient. Vlad, seeing his internal support dwindle and the loyalty of his own people turn towards his brother, was forced to flee again. He sought refuge in Transylvania, where he hoped to receive aid from Matthias Corvinus, the King of Hungary. Radu the Handsome's ascent marked a significant shift in Wallachia's control. It was not a direct Ottoman military victory, but the triumph of a political strategy that exploited internal divisions and the exhaustion of the people. Wallachia entered a period of relative peace, but under the softer, yet firm yoke of the Ottoman Empire, with a voivode who was, in essence, a Turkish agent. Vlad the Impaler's fate was now in the hands of his supposed Christian allies. Vlad III's flight to Transylvania in 1462, following the rise of his brother Radu the Handsome and the loss of support in Wallachia, marked a moment of profound irony and betrayal. Vlad, who had positioned himself as the fierce defender of Christendom against the Ottoman advance, now sought refuge and aid from Matthias Corvinus, the King of Hungary. It was a fatal miscalculation. Far from finding an ally, Vlad found a trap, resulting in his imprisonment and a long period of captivity. Matthias Corvinus, son of the legendary John Hunyadi, the general who had orchestrated the deaths of Vlad's father and brother, was a cunning and pragmatic ruler. Although Vlad was a declared enemy of the Ottomans, his reputation for brutality and his independence made him an uncomfortable figure for Western Christian kingdoms. Many European nobles viewed him as a monster, not a hero, and feared his methods as much as, if not more than, those of the Turks. Matthias Corvinus's betrayal had complex and quite cynical motivations. Officially, Corvinus claimed to have intercepted letters purportedly written by Vlad that showed his intention to entice Christendom into an alliance with the Turks in exchange for the Wallachian throne. These letters, known as the Targoviste letters, though likely forged by Hungarian or Saxon agents who desired Vlad's removal, especially the Saxon merchants who had suffered his atrocities, served as the perfect justification for Vlad's imprisonment. The true motive, however, may have been more pragmatic and dishonorable for the Hungarian king. Matthias Corvinus had received a substantial sum of money from Pope Pius II to finance a crusade against the Ottomans, and it was expected that he would use this money to support Vlad. However, Corvinus, who had other priorities and possibly distrusted Vlad, or did not want a large-scale war with the Ottomans, spent the money on himself and his own interests. Vlad's imprisonment, based on proof of treason, allowed him to justify not using the papal funds for the crusade and to avoid an immediate conflict with the powerful Ottoman Empire, protecting his own borders. Thus, under the pretext of a new alliance or a summons to discuss strategies against the Turks, Vlad was lured into a trap. Upon crossing the Tisa River to meet Matthias, he was arrested without trial, shackled like an ordinary criminal. His protests were ignored, and news of his capture spread rapidly, causing despair among his few remaining allies and relief among his many enemies. Vlad's imprisonment, which would last for 13 long years, was a devastating blow to Wallachia and to the prince himself. He had sacrificed himself, defended the border with blood and terror, only to be betrayed by the very Christians he swore to protect. This act of hypocrisy and political convenience on the part of Matthias Corvinus reinforced Vlad's cynical view of human nature and politics, further deepening his distrust and his resolve that, to survive, one had to be relentless. The Impaler was now, ironically, in the position of a prisoner, awaiting an uncertain fate. Vlad III's 13 long years of captivity which began in 1462, were not spent in an ordinary dungeon, but in the castle of Visegrad, an imposing fortress of the Hungarian crown situated above the Danube amidst dark forests and misty hills. Although it was a prison, Visegrad was not a place of absolute destitution. Vlad was not subjected to physical tortures by the Hungarians, but to a political and psychological isolation that, for many, would have been equally devastating. Far from Wallachia, from blood and from stakes, he retreated into himself, and the silence of the prison, paradoxically, did not tame the beast, but forged it further. In prison, Vlad refused to eat the food offered by the Hungarians as a sign of his resistance and disdain. He conversed only with monks, using religious discussions as a way to keep his mind active, and perhaps to find some divine justification for his brutality. He wrote encrypted letters in Latin to old allies, proof that, even incarcerated, his strategic mind continued to operate, planning an eventual return. He drew maps of fortresses he no longer controlled, a mental exercise of his mastery of war and territory. Time, which for others would be a boring punishment, for Vlad was a forge. Each day of isolation added another layer of tempered steel to his skin, making him more resilient and more calculating. His cell, which had only a slit through which morning light entered, bore witness to his unwavering discipline. Vlad rose before it every day as a ritual, maintaining a routine that defied the idleness of imprisonment. Where most men would have gone mad or succumbed to despair, Vlad became something even more lethal, a master of patience and anticipation. Outside the walls of Visegrad, the world continued to convulse. Wallachia, now a puppet kingdom under the rule of Radu the Handsome, became increasingly dependent on the Ottomans. The people, oppressed by heavy taxes and controlled by foreign forces, murmured laments in taverns and churches, yearning for change. And Vlad's legend, instead of fading with his absence, grew like a flame lit in the darkness. It was said that Vlad conversed with angels and demons in prison, that a raven landed daily on his window, the slit in his cell, and whispered news from the east, or that no Hungarian guard dared meet his gaze, for his eyes gleamed with a terrible intensity. Accounts, many of them part of popular folklore, also claimed that the iron chains in his cell trembled at night, suggesting a supernatural force within his confinement. It was fear that kept Vlad alive in the memory of men, both his enemies who dreaded his return, and his own people, who saw him as the lost avenger who would one day return in flames. In Hungary, Matthias Corvinus began to shift his stance toward Vlad. Ottoman threats mounted, with Mehmed II extending his influence throughout the Balkans and even to the Austrian border. To confront this growing shadow over Central Europe, it might be necessary to release the monster. Thus, the years in Visegrad, though a period of deprivation of freedom, were for Vlad a phase of transformation, where his legend deepened and his determination to retake the throne became unbreakable. He was not dead. He was merely waiting and growing stronger in the darkness. Vlad III's years of captivity in Visegrad, far from Wallachian lands and the stage of his atrocities, did not diminish his fame. On the contrary, they transformed and amplified it through a series of legends and tales that spread across Europe. These narratives, often grim and grotesque, helped keep the Impaler's image alive, even in his confinement, and reinforced his reputation for unwavering cruelty. One of the most widespread legends about Vlad's time in Visegrad prison is that he maintained his appetite for cruelty by capturing birds and rats and impaling them on small stakes. It is said that he would order his guards to bring him these small animals, and then, with miniature wooden stakes, he would replicate his execution methods on a reduced scale. While this story is frequently cited, it is difficult to prove historically, and is likely part of the propaganda created by his enemies, especially the German Saxons who hated him, to demonize his image. However, the fact that such a legend gained traction shows how deeply his cruelty was already rooted in popular imagination. Other folk tales, particularly in Romania, speak of a supernatural connection Vlad possessed during his captivity. It was said that he conversed with angels and demons, or that a raven landed daily on his window, the slit in his cell, and whispered news from the east, keeping him informed about events in his realm and the Ottoman Empire. These stories, though obviously apocryphal, reflect the popular belief that Vlad was a man of extraordinary power, operating beyond human limits, with an almost demonic cunning and coldness. There are also accounts that no Hungarian guard dared meet his gaze, for his eyes gleamed with a terrible intensity and a sinister glow, and that the iron chains in his cell would tremble at night, as if Vlad's very fury could shake the iron. These narratives, even if not factual, reveal how the fear and respect for his figure transcended the prison walls. The guards, perhaps influenced by the Impaler's reputation, may have genuinely felt an aura of terror in his presence. These tales, whether true or merely products of propaganda and folklore, were crucial for the maintenance and growth of Vlad's legend. Even distant from the battlefield, he continued to be a force to be feared and respected. German pamphlets, which were already circulating throughout Europe describing his atrocities in graphic detail, only gained more traction with these new stories of his supposed cruelty in prison. They helped consolidate his reputation as one of history's most brutal rulers, paving the way for his eventual immortalization in the figure of Dracula. For his own people, however, these legends could have a different meaning. They might reinforce the idea that Vlad, even imprisoned, was a living, untamable force, a guardian who would one day return to free them from the Ottoman yoke. Thus, Vlad's imprisonment, instead of being his end, became another chapter in the construction of his ambivalent image, a monster for his Western enemies, and a dark martyr for many of his own people, a man whose appetite for order and justice, in his own way, persisted even behind bars. After 13 long years of captivity in Visegrad Castle, Vlad III's fortunes began to turn in 1475. It was not an act of forgiveness or clemency, but a strategic liberation dictated by the growing geopolitical needs of Hungary and Central Europe. Matthias Corvinus, the Hungarian king who had imprisoned him, now faced an increasingly audacious and persistent Ottoman threat. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror, continued his expansion through the Balkans, threatening Hungarian borders and even Western Europe itself. Wallachia, under the more compliant rule of Radu the Handsome, Vlad's brother and an Ottoman ally, no longer served as an effective bulwark against the Turks. In fact, it had become a corridor for their incursions. Corvinus, who had previously preferred to avoid direct confrontation with the Ottomans, realized he needed a fierce guard dog on the Wallachian frontier, and there was no one more fierce and more anti-Ottoman than Vlad III. The Impaler's reputation, however feared, now became a valuable asset. He was the only leader with the experience and brutality necessary to stem the Turkish tide. For Matthias, liberating Vlad was a pragmatic measure, a military and political necessity to protect his own domains. Vlad, now around 44 years old, emerged from captivity hardened, but with his strategic mind sharp. His time in prison had given him a unique perspective on European politics and the fragility of alliances. He was no longer just a prince thirsty for revenge, but a seasoned player in the great game of power. Vlad's release was not immediate or unconditional. He was kept under surveillance for a time in Hungary, and Matthias Corvinus wanted to ensure that Vlad was aligned with Hungarian interests. Part of this strategy included a series of compromises. Vlad had to reaffirm his loyalty to the Hungarian crown, and, crucially, had to convert from Orthodox Christianity to Catholicism, the official faith of the Kingdom of Hungary. This conversion, though possibly superficial for Vlad, who was a man of his own pragmatic faith, was an important symbol of his new alliance and a requirement for his Hungarian support. With the rising Ottoman threat, Vlad's usefulness outweighed the distrust he inspired. His proven ability to inflict terror and cause significant casualties to the Turks, as demonstrated in the 1462 campaign, was an asset Matthias Corvinus could not ignore. Thus, Vlad's liberation was not an acknowledgement of innocence or heroism, but a cold calculation of necessity. He was a brutal warrior who, at that moment, fit perfectly into the Hungarian defense strategy against a common enemy. This phase of Vlad's life marks his transition from prisoner to a key player in a complex geopolitical chessboard. He was released to fight once more, not for redemption, but for convenience, and was ready to resume his role as Wallachia's bloodthirsty defender, now with the support and distrust of his former captors. The Impaler was back, and the stage was set for his third and final act. Vlad III's liberation in 1475, though strategic, was not a blank check. Matthias Corvinus, the Hungarian king, wished to ensure that Vlad was firmly aligned with Hungarian interests and that his ferocity would be directed against the Ottomans rather than against Western allies or the Hungarian crown itself. To cement this alliance and further legitimize him on the European stage, Vlad was obliged to enter into a political marriage. The choice of his bride was of paramount importance. He married Ilona Szilágyi, a noblewoman from the powerful Hunyadi family, and, crucially, a cousin of King Matthias Corvinus himself. This marriage was not an arrangement born of love, but a purely pragmatic and calculating act, typical of medieval politics. The union with Ilona Szilágyi, granddaughter of John Hunyadi, his father's former tormentor, which was a biting irony, granted Vlad Hungarian lineage and integrated him into one of Hungary's most prestigious noble families. This familial connection was vital. It gave him prestige and legitimacy among Hungarian nobles, and by extension, in the eyes of other Western courts that still viewed him with suspicion due to his reputation for brutality and his past dealings with the Ottomans. For Vlad, this matrimonial alliance represented a fundamental step in reclaiming the Wallachian throne, not merely by military force, but also by a legitimate right as the son-in-law of the Hungarian crown. This contrasted with his two previous attempts to ascend, which were more volatile and based on direct support, whether Ottoman or through pure military victories. With this marriage, Vlad ceased to be a tolerated prisoner and became an acceptable candidate and a potential ally in the great power game of Europe. The marriage was also a way for Matthias Corvinus to maintain a certain degree of control over Vlad. By tying him through familial and political bonds to his own house, the Hungarian king hoped to secure Vlad's loyalty and direct his energies towards the fight against the Ottomans, preventing him from becoming an unpredictable threat. It is important to note that little is known about Ilona Szilágyi's personal life or her relationship with Vlad. Chronicles focus on the political implications of the marriage, not its emotional dimension. Vlad had previously been married to a Wallachian noblewoman and had children, but this new marriage represented a reinvention of his political image. With this maneuver, Vlad gained not only the tacit and at times limited support of Hungarian troops, but also a legitimacy that had been lacking in his exiles and previous attempts at reconquest. He was now positioned not just as a brutal warrior, but as a member of the Western Christian elite, ready to play his role as a frontier defender. Vlad's political marriage was a masterful move that paved the way for his third and final return to power in Wallachia, a return that would be marked by more bloodshed and a tragic and mysterious end. The political chessboard of Wallachia was being rearranged in 1475, and a crucial piece exited the stage abruptly and conveniently for Vlad III. Radu the Handsome, his brother and the Ottoman puppet ruler. Radu's death, after a sudden and suspicious illness, opened the breach Vlad had awaited for years to, finally, reclaim the throne more enduringly. Although the exact causes of his death are not entirely clear, and there is little definitive historical proof, the convenience of his demise raised many eyebrows and fueled speculation about the possibility of assassination. Radu the Handsome had governed Wallachia for about a decade since 1462, when his brother Vlad was imprisoned. His reign was characterized by relative peace and stability, but at the cost of submission to the Ottoman Empire. He had dismantled the forest of the Impaled, allowing the bodies to be removed, and pursued a policy of conciliation with the Turks, which on one hand alleviated the suffering of the exhausted population, but on the other consolidated Ottoman influence over the principality. Radu had no legitimate male heirs, which added a layer of instability to the succession and, upon his death, would leave the throne vacant. The timing of Radu's death was perfect for Vlad. Having been released from Hungarian prison and strengthened by his political marriage to the cousin of King Matthias Corvinus, Vlad was more prepared than ever for a return. With Radu out of the way, the Wallachian throne was open, and the absence of a strong pro-Ottoman successor created a power vacuum that Vlad was eager to fill. While there is no concrete evidence directly linking Vlad or his agents to Radu's death, the political atmosphere of the time was one of constant intrigue, and political assassinations were not uncommon. The sudden illness of important figures at strategic moments always generated suspicion. Was Radu a victim of an Ottoman conspiracy that viewed him as a ruler too weak to resist a possible counteroffensive by Vlad? Or was he eliminated by Vlad's agents, impatient to accelerate the Impaler's return? History does not provide a definitive answer, but the possibility of external intervention, whether Hungarian or from factions loyal to Vlad, remains a plausible theory. Radu's death resulted in a period of instability in Wallachia. Without a clear successor and with strong but now leaderless Ottoman influence, the principality became a stage for new disputes. This instability, ironically, served Vlad's purposes. He could present himself as the only leader strong enough to restore order and defend Wallachia, this time against the Ottoman threat that Radu could not effectively contain. Thus, the demise of Radu the Handsome marked the end of an era of softer vassalage and paved the way for Vlad III's third and final ascent to power. Wallachia was about to plunge back into the darkness of his rule, but with the promise of fierce resistance against its external enemies. Destiny, or perhaps a hidden hand, had conspired in favor of the Impaler, giving him the opportunity to return and seal his legacy with more blood. With the convenient death of his brother Radu the Handsome and the strengthening of his position through alliances and a political marriage, Vlad III, the Impaler, was ready for his third and final return to the Wallachian throne. On November 26, 1476, he was crowned Voivode of Wallachia once again, an event that promised a new era of order, but also a return to the brutality that had made him famous. This reign, however, would be tragically short, lasting only a few weeks. Yet its intensity and the circumstances of its end would solidify his legend. Vlad returned to Wallachia with limited Hungarian support, a contingent of troops provided by Matthias Corvinus, and assistance from Stephen Bathory, the voivode of Transylvania. He also relied on the loyalty of exiled Wallachian nobles and peasants who, though they feared his cruelty, saw him as the only leader capable of resisting Ottoman dominion and restoring order. His entry into the capital, Târgoviște, this time, was not marked by major battles against the internal nobility, but by a return to power based on his reputation and the vacuum left by Radu's death. Once in power, Vlad acted swiftly to re-establish his authority and his draconian policies. Stakes were once again erected in the fields around the cities and along the roads, a grim and unmistakable warning for anyone who dared defy his will. Traitors, Ottoman spies, corrupt tax collectors, and nobles who hesitated to pledge loyalty were impaled without mercy. Fear once again became the primary tool of governance, spreading like unholy incense over the land, and indeed order returned. Roads became safe, theft and crime dramatically decreased, and obedience to the prince's laws was absolute. A Saxon chronicler, though a critic of Vlad, observed that Vlad's Wallachia was the only place in the world where one could leave a golden cup by the roadside and find it untouched the next day. This peace, imposed by terror, came at a price. The tension in the air was thick, and murmurs of prayers asking for days to pass without a visit from the voivode's soldiers were common in the villages. Silence became security, and submission, a necessary virtue for survival. However, Vlad's true motivation for returning was the fight against the Ottomans. He knew that Mehmed II would not allow such a defiant ruler to remain on the borders of his empire. Wallachia was a strategic land, a natural corridor between the Danube and the Carpathians, crucial for controlling the region. Vlad initiated a frantic diplomatic campaign, writing to the Pope, to Venice, to Poland, and to the Holy Roman Empire, offering himself as Christendom's shield. He gathered advisors and generals in his rebuilt fortress at Curtea de Argeș, proclaiming, "The Turks will come with their thousands, but we have the forests, the cold, the shadows, and the name they whisper between their teeth." Though his reign was short, it marked a resumption of Wallachian resistance against Ottoman dominion. Vlad had proven once again that he was a fearsome and effective leader, capable of imposing his will and defending his realm against all odds. Nevertheless, The fate of his last reign was sealed by the intensity of his enemies and the inevitable response of the Sultan, who would not tolerate a third challenge. The Impaler had returned, but his journey was about to reach a bloody end. Vlad III's third and final reign was as fleeting as it was intense, and its end, in December 1476 or January 1477, remains shrouded in mystery and controversy. Despite his reputation as a relentless warrior, the exact manner of his death is one of the great enigmas of his biography, with various versions that further fueled his legend. There was no large-scale final confrontation with Sultan Mehmed II, but rather a darker, more enigmatic conclusion. Vlad had returned to power with the clear objective of repelling Ottoman influence and restoring Wallachia's independence. In the autumn of 1476, an Ottoman force crossed the Danube, led by one of Mehmed II's most loyal generals. Thousands of Turkish soldiers marched into Wallachia, seeking to force Vlad into a direct confrontation. But the voivode, who knew the terrain and mastered terror like no other, engaged in relentless guerrilla warfare, with lightning ambushes, night attacks, and the continuous use of impalement to demoralize the enemy. The Ottoman general, upon encountering the forest of the Impaled again, reportedly retreated, saying, "I will not fight against a man who rules with the dead." However, the war of attrition and constant Ottoman pressure took its toll. His own men were weary, resources dwindled, and the Wallachian population suffered the consequences of prolonged conflict. In one of the decisive clashes near Târgoviște Castle, or perhaps in a surprise attack against an Ottoman garrison near Bucharest, Vlad was gravely wounded. A treacherous blow almost ended his life, but he resisted, swearing that his spirit would never be broken. It is here that the versions of his death diverge most dramatically: betrayal by mercenary guards. One of the most accepted theories suggests that Vlad was betrayed by his own mercenary bodyguards. These soldiers, possibly bribed by his enemies, whether rival boyars, Ottoman agents, or even King Matthias Corvinus, who perhaps desired his demise, allegedly ambushed and assassinated him. This version aligns with the pattern of betrayals that marked Vlad's life: death in combat by friend or disguised foe. Another popular version claims that Vlad was killed by his own troops by mistake. He often used Turkish disguises to infiltrate enemy camps or for reconnaissance. In a moment of chaotic combat, he might have been mistaken for an enemy and attacked by his own men. This tactic, which had served him well in the past, would have proved fatal in his last moments. Death in battle against the Ottomans. A third, less detailed but equally possible theory is that Vlad simply fell in fierce combat against Ottoman forces, fighting until his last breath, sword in hand, faithful to his vow never to surrender. Whatever the truth, what is known for certain is that he was decapitated, and his head was sent to Constantinople as irrefutable proof of his death, displayed on a stake, much like the countless victims of his own preferred method of execution. Vlad's head was the ultimate trophy for Sultan Mehmed II, a symbol of the end of the Wallachian rebellion and Ottoman victory. Vlad's death, therefore, was not merely the end of a man, but the culmination of an era. His physical disappearance initiated his immortalization as a legend, a figure who would transcend history to become an eternal symbol of fear, resistance, and relentless cruelty. The confirmation of Vlad III, the Impaler's death, did not come from a dignified burial or a formal ceremony, but from an act of triumph and desecration by his enemies: the display of his head in Constantinople. This macabre gesture was irrefutable proof for Sultan Mehmed II that the terrible voivode of Wallachia, who had challenged and humiliated him so greatly, was finally no longer a threat. It was the ultimate trophy of a victory over an adversary who dared question the power of the Ottoman Empire. After his mysterious death in combat or by betrayal, Vlad's body was decapitated. The head, severed from the body, was then carefully preserved, likely in honey or salt to prevent decomposition during the long journey, and transported over long distances to the capital of the Ottoman Empire. The journey of Vlad's head to Constantinople was, in itself, a narrative of triumph for the Ottomans, serving as a visible and tangible demonstration of their power over the most formidable enemy they had faced in Eastern Europe. Once in Constantinople, Vlad's head was publicly displayed on a stake, This act, laden with symbolism, directly echoed Vlad's own preferred methods. He, who had impaled tens of thousands of enemies and traitors, having their heads displayed to terrorize and demoralize, now saw his own head subjected to the same fate. It was a form of poetic justice for the Ottomans, an inversion of the terror he had inflicted. The image of Vlad's head on a stake, in a public square of Constantinople, would be a clear warning to any other ruler who dared defy the Sultan. For Sultan Mehmed II, the display of Vlad's head represented the end of an irritating saga. The Impaler had been a thorn in the empire's side, diverting resources and attention from other conquests and challenging the perception of Ottoman invincibility. Vlad's death and the display of his head consolidated Ottoman control over Wallachia, at least for a time, and allowed Mehmed II to focus his efforts on other campaigns. However, for the Wallachian people and for many Christians in Eastern Europe, the display of Vlad's head in Constantinople did not erase his legend. On the contrary, it transformed it. For his enemies, it was proof that the monster was dead. But for many of his subjects, and for popular memory, it became the sign of a fallen martyr, a defender who had fought to the bitter end against impossible odds. The story of his decapitation and display added an element of tragedy and heroism to his already complex image, solidifying his status as a legendary figure, even in defeat. The absence of his body and the display of his head in a foreign land also contributed to the mystery surrounding his burial place, a debate that persists to this day. The head in Constantinople was brutal proof of his death, but the absent body allowed the legend of his return, or his vigilant spirit, to persist among his people. The display of Vlad's head was thus the last act of his historical life and the first step toward his immortalization as a myth. The figure of Vlad III, the Impaler, transcended death to become one of the most complex and ambivalent characters in European history, possessing a dual legacy that portrays him simultaneously as a national hero and a bloodthirsty monster. This duality is the key to understanding his resonance through the centuries and how his image has been appropriated and transformed in different cultural contexts. In Romania, especially from the 19th century onwards, as nationalist sentiment began to flourish, Vlad III was resurrected and elevated to the status of a national hero. For Romanians, Vlad was not a sadistic tyrant, but a fierce defender of the homeland against the relentless expansion of the Ottoman Empire. His brutal methods, however horrifying, were seen as a pragmatic necessity in times of extreme violence, an adequate response to an enemy that threatened the very existence of Wallachia and the Christian faith. He was praised for restoring order, eliminating corruption, and maintaining the principality's independence against overwhelming odds. Vlad's figure became a symbol of resistance, courage, and sovereignty, someone who did not bow to foreign powers and who preferred internal terror to external submission. Modern Romanian historians and poets celebrated him as a strong and just voivode who did what was necessary to protect his people. In the West, however, Vlad's image solidified in a drastically different way, as a bloodthirsty monster. This reputation was largely fueled by German pamphlets that circulated widely from the late 15th century. These pamphlets, often commissioned by Transylvanian Saxon merchants who suffered directly from his campaigns of terror, exaggerated his atrocities, describing him as a cruel despot who delighted in torture and suffering. They depicted scenes of mass impalement, boiling alive, flaying, and other unimaginable forms of cruelty, with the aim of shocking and demonizing Vlad for the European public. These publications became some of history's first horror bestsellers, spreading his fame as an unparalleled sadist. For Western Europe, Vlad was the personification of evil, a ruler who surpassed all limits of barbarism. This disparity in perception is fundamental to Vlad's legacy. The same brutality that made him a martyr of resistance in the East made him a demon in the West. He became a mirror of the society that observed him. For some, the necessary price of freedom. For others, the most repulsive face of absolute power. This duality would be immortalized in literature. While Romanians saw a defender, the Irish writer Bram Stoker, inspired by Western accounts, would transform Dracula, son of the dragon devil, into the archetypal vampire figure. Thus, Vlad's legacy is not monolithic. He is a figure who defies simple classifications, a personification of the tensions and paradoxes of medieval history. His cruelty, undeniable, is contextualized by an equally brutal era where violence was a common language of power. His story is a reminder that the line between hero and villain, avenger and monster, often depends on perspective and the prevailing narrative. He remains a controversial and fascinating figure who continues to captivate audiences centuries after his death. With Vlad III's death in 1476, Wallachia plunged once again into a power vacuum and a period of instability. But the Impaler's figure had already left an indelible mark that would shape the region's political and economic landscape for centuries and initiate his eternity as a legend. The Ottoman Empire, now free from its most formidable adversary, consolidated its influence over the principality, though it never fully annexed it, preferring to maintain it as a buffer vassal state with more compliant rulers. The immediate political landscape after Vlad's death was one of succession instability. Various princes, often supported by the Ottomans or the Hungarians, alternated on the Wallachian throne in a cycle of depositions and restorations. Ottoman influence became predominant. Governors loyal to the Sultan were appointed to administer the settlements, and tributes, previously refused by Vlad, were re-established and, at times, increased. Fortresses Vlad had strengthened, like Poenari, fell into disuse or were abandoned, and the symbols of his resistance were dismantled. In the economic aspect, Wallachia suffered the consequences of long wars and scorched earth policies. Trade, vital for the region's prosperity, was interrupted or redirected under Ottoman control. Peasants, though free from the terror of Vlad's impalements, now faced the oppression of Ottoman taxes and the uncertainty of an often ineffective and corrupt government imposed by foreign powers. The stability and internal order that Vlad had imposed with his brutality disappeared, and crime and anarchy resurfaced in some areas. However, Vlad's legacy did not fade. For the Wallachian people, especially the peasants he had defended from the nobility and bandits, the memory of Vlad the Impaler persisted. Instead of being forgotten as a tyrant, he began to be transformed into a myth. In secluded convents and churches, manuscripts recorded his life not just as a prince, but as a martyr and a dark defender of faith and nation. Whispers that he had made a pact with darkness, not to dominate but to protect, began to circulate, fueling his mystical aura. The absence of his body, with only his head being displayed in Constantinople, and the mysteries surrounding his burial place, contributed to this mystification. The lack of a tomb to venerate or lament allowed the legend of his return, or his vigilant spirit, to persist among his people. Popular tales spoke of sightings of a hooded knight in the ruins of Poenari, or of howls that did not come from wolves, but from impaled souls still crying for vengeance, showing the profound psychological impact he left. In the long term, Vlad's challenge to the Ottoman Empire, even if it cost him his life and did not guarantee immediate independence, became an enduring symbol of resistance. In times of crisis and foreign domination, Vlad's figure re-emerged as an icon of Wallachian and, subsequently, Romanian sovereignty. This figure, distorted and magnified over centuries, would eventually inspire Bram Stoker's Dracula, transforming the historical prince into an immortal vampire and solidifying his presence in global popular imagination. Thus, the post-war scenario in Wallachia was one of continued Ottoman dominance, but also of a persistence of the memory of a leader who, through his brutality, managed to leave an indomitable mark on the history and culture of his nation.